Okay, so laying out what the heck we mean by state, we then come up with a number of characteristics of how it is that state and church interact. And let me be clear, when I say church, I don't mean this in terms of the church sect theory we were just studying, but church is kind of a broad reference to any way that religion kind of officially interacts with state actors. So this could be in terms of individual beliefs, as we'll see in a little bit in terms of institution, or it could be particular groups. Okay, so keep that broadly in mind. But basically, what we end up with is a number of ways of, if you will, of interactions. And there's a couple that I want to talk about that are important in church-state relationships. One is that sociologists usually think of the state in particular as the key place for both political and symbolic power that define the rules of the game, okay? So the rules of the game in this instance in the United States in church and state relationships are what religious institutions or behaviors will be tolerated, broadly understood, and will be regulated or not by any type of state level of authority. An example of this is from the Whitty reading, and you'll recall in reading that the author is struggling to tell us, well, what the heck was the conception of religion and permissive religious behavior at the founding of the United States of America. And a great example in here, in terms of the rules of the game, is that Whitty points out a few quirky things, which is right after the First Amendment that deals with religion is established, in that exact same body that passes that amendment, that same body also passed a couple things. One, a space for chaplains, I think a little bit of funding for them to open the beginnings of sessions with prayers. There was some space and some funding for religious-inspired education. And then also there's this funny little tradition that you may have heard of before called Thanksgiving, where one of the representatives said, hey, now that we've done all this great stuff, shouldn't we have space, or shouldn't we have kind of a federal support or proclamation for this holiday to give thanks to God for all that's just transpired in this religious session? So you can see that in terms of church and state relationships, we're interested to know, like, what are the rules of the game? Whether they make logical sense or not, which is what Whitty's trying to do, we want to note the places where certain rules and certain activities are allowed to happen. Another type of interaction that we see in church-state relationships is what we would call a path-dependent interaction. And what this means is that at a certain point, when a certain rule gets set in the game, there's a path that opens up to go down, which is very hard to get off of for institutions, whether state or religious actors down the road. And let me explain what the heck I mean here. In the US case, what happens really early is this warning that there should be no establishment of a state religion, okay? What this meant at the time, as Whitty tells us, was that there would be no federal role in declaring a national religion. So this doesn't happen in the founding of the United States in the constitutional documents. But what's interesting is that this sends us down a path where we would never expect to see a federal establishment of state religion on the one hand, but also because this path is what we start to go down as a country, later on what becomes very problematic are state level, i.e. Indiana, Arizona, California, state level establishment of religion. Because at the time of the founding of the U.S. Constitution, at the various state levels, Arizona, California, Indiana, even though those weren't around at the beginning of the Constitution, but you get my point, various states had various religions that they were basically promoting or supporting, whether it be in Massachusetts or Maryland or New York. There were laws on the books, and later on states in the early 1800s that basically kind of promoted or had a special place for one or another religious groups. What's important in this path-dependent argument is that once the federal government started to go down a certain path of no establishing, in other words, we're not going to establish a particular religion, then later on when states are challenged around their establishment of religion, people in courts look to this federal path that we're going down to decide on the state level. And so we have this general kind of swinging open of the gate, going down a path of no establishment, and that then drives a lot of activity as we go down the road. And then one other thing to keep in mind in terms of interaction is how religion and state use each other. Okay, let me just say a couple of quick examples on this. These are clear. The state can use religious groups quite easily, and it did so. It was in the state's interest in the mid to late 1800s to try and suppress and try and wipe out Native American groups across the United States, particularly in the West. And lo and behold, religious groups, which were always just pushing forward on the frontier to bring not only kind of moral messages, but to bring institutions like education and meeting places and to kind of keep frontier communities going, these religious groups became part and parcel in basically tearing apart Native communities. The classic examples are on the religious schools that were begun on the frontier that would pluck individuals out of Native American communities, take them away from their parents, teach them, but also indoctrinate them in religious teachings, and by doing so basically kind of destroy the fabric of Native communities, not only physically, but also in terms of their symbolic and meaning systems, and thereby kind of break down Native communities that make it easier for settling communities to gain control of lands and property and processes and just general symbolic control that allowed for the settling of the western frontier. So that's one way that state can use religion, but then religion can also use the state. An example of this is some research that I'm starting to do that shows that will show that in the western part of the United States in this day and age, a lot of new religious groups, especially kind of evangelical or mega churches, will often start not by buying a building and putting up a steeple and building pews and saying, everybody, hey, come to my church. But they'll often start by using the local school auditorium on the weekends because that auditorium sits closed, right? So oftentimes these church groups, to keep costs low, will use school auditoriums because it's there. They can rent it for the day, have no overhead for the rest of the week in terms of heating, plumbing, vacuuming, and that sort of thing, but will use this for the first couple of years of their existence to kind of get going and to get into the religious marketplace. So you can see that religion and state use each other for their own purposes. So that's a key point in thinking about church and state relationships. Now, to bring us a little bit back to that witty reading, I wanted to say a few things about historical roots, if you will, because history is important when we think about church and state relationships. So let's paint broadly and then more specifically. Broadly, in terms of church-state relationships, we have the Protestant Reformation, which we've heard about before, which did two things. One, it introduced kind of this idea of religious pluralism, that there would be different religious groups, at least in Western Christianity, and that these religious groups would strive to have to be able to practice their own religion, but also to be heard by both religious and state authorities. And it also introduced the idea of religious freedom, that there could be different religious visions that would coexist alongside each other within the same political atmosphere or within the same state, England, France, Germany, and that not having a uniformity of religion within a state could be an okay thing to have happen. And hence we get the whole American experiment, and you know that from your history classes. But the other broad history brush to kind of paint with is the whole Enlightenment tradition, which coming out of the Protestant Reformation spun some new ideas, which said that basically we could have this thing called freedom of conscience, whereby the most important locus of religion was not necessarily in a religious group, but was in the mind of individual believers. And so you get classic examples of this are Thomas